Okay. I've just got so many different kind of versions of what I want to say. I have to figure out which I'm going to use. I'll probably skip around. We ended last time having introduced the structure of the relationship between faith and pure insight. Pure insight representing the Enlightenment project. And I said that they shared, both faith and pure insight, shared fundamental premises, namely that they both believe that the authoritative grounds for believing any claim has to be subject to the claims of subjectivity, that truth or universality is immediately accessible to subjectivity and particularity, and that secondly, to be in possession of any claim on these authenticating grounds is to be in possession of grounds of belief that are universal. So they both want, as it were, in very different ways to think the I think. That is, that moment of utter subjectivity and utter universality. I went on to suggest, and I want to spin this out a little bit now, that this section of the Phenomenology provides the structural underpinnings for Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment. And we can see this by just looking at the structure of the chapter in part. The chapter is divided into two parts. The first part involves the argument that Enlightenment thought construes all religious belief, here faith, as nothing but anthropomorphic illusion. That is, this is just the classical problem of the critique of religion, right? That religion is nothing but the projection of the human onto nature. And that's all religion has ever been, is the projection of the human onto the natural world. The job of enlightenment critique, is to provide a permanent critique of all illusion. And that enlightenment is going to argue that something is an illusion if it is a projection of human meaning onto the natural world, onto material nature. Now, if we think about this claim for just a moment, it actually is a bit of a scorched earth policy. Right? Because the question is, what counts as a projection of the human onto the material world? And the argument can be, and indeed by Enlightenment rationality has been, that any claim that is relative to the human standpoint, that is relative to an individual seeing the world from a definite perspective, can count as an anthropomorphic illusion. Hence, the idea of anthropomorphic illusion has an immensely wide and skeptical scope. Clearly, things having colors is relative to our sensory apparatus. Our capacity to think of other human beings as speaking meaningfully is relevant to our responding to them in certain ways. Hence, from a certain standpoint, simply to regard another human being as human is an anthropomorphic illusion, since it's a relational and relative claim. Now, this is exactly the difficulty that Horkheimer and Adorno detect in the notion of Enlightenment critique, that it has no intelligible stopping place. No place it can say this except the I think itself. That is, the only thing left, if you keep going through the process of critique, would be the critic, him or herself. So the very notion of Enlightenment critique is the principle of a radical negativity. It is, Enlightenment is, if I'm right, a form of skepticism. Which is why Adorno and Horkheimer say that the critique of myth becomes itself a return to myth. We are going to see that this restless negativity, this skepticism, this idea of tolerating nothing that does not stand up to the criteria of self-evidence, right, is going to run right through from Enlightenment to the French Terror. In fact, it's going to be the same movement. The French Terror, you might say, is Enlightenment rationality in practice. That's certainly Hegel's claim. The second part of the chapter, pure insight, then asks, well, what kind of content can Enlightenment rationality have? What is Enlightenment other than critique? And as I suggested at the end last week, the substance of critique, the sense that critique is valuable, the sense that critique is meaningful, turns on its capacity to dissolve illusions. And illusions are going to, again, be anything that's relational. So it's going to have this sense that it's continuously making progress, but that power, that sense of power, is itself, if this is right, wholly skeptical. So that philosophy in this mode gets a grip on us because of its skeptical power. Enlightenment can be, therefore, at the end of the day, nothing but the self thinking itself. It reduces to the principle of apperceptive self-awareness, the I think. Hence, Enlightenment reason, without its critical object, without anything to critique, is literally subject without substance. Enlightenment needs faith. It receives all its capacity to look like it's accomplishing something from its critical object. of course, I mention this here because one way in which Hegel presents the entire phenomenology at the beginning of the book in the preface, which eventually we'll get to maybe, is subject becoming substance and substance becoming subject. Well, to say that we are at this moment of subject without substance, right, is a kind of realization of the problem, right, that in part inaugurated Hegel's project. So for Hegel, and I would argue for Adorno, the epitome of the Enlightenment subject is just the empty self thinking itself, which is to say, again, that enlightenment borrows its worth from the object it repudiates. It borrows its worth from the object it repudiates, and that you should hear in that, right, something like the relationship between master and slave, right? The master receiving all his recognition from the being that, right? I mean, so now we've got this in a deep epistemic structure, which we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment only has any worth in relationship to the very thing it devalues, namely appearances. And it takes all appearances to be, or discovers all appearances to be illusory, right? So it can't make any worthwhile distinction between appearance and illusion. Hence, it cannot have any productive notion of shine. So this is what Adorno and Horkheimer mean by the thought that enlightenment is the critique of myth, that is, of anthropomorphism, that ends up turning on itself. And the reason we can say that it's turning on itself is because it is indeed getting, since it's getting all its content from the object it criticizes, then it is non-detachable, right? It's absolutely dependent on its critical object. So in paragraph 324, Hegel says, suffix, sure. It's one of those nice long paragraphs, 4 lines. Thank God. In the first place, in regard to the relation of the inner to this, this can't be right. I'm sorry. Paragraph. No, it must be so it's paragraph 541, I reckon. It's the end of paragraph 529, or toward the end. It's an endless paragraph. It's over the page 324, where he says, pure insight at the top of the page has therefore, in the first instance, no content of its own, because it is negative being for self. To faith, on the other hand, there belongs a content, but without insight. Okay, so we've got now the old hobby horse, right? That insight is empty, and that faith is blind. So we now know that insight is just another word for the concept, and faith another word for intuition. But of course, he's not going to argue, this is not Kant, he's not going to argue that concepts without intuitions are empty and intuitions without concepts are blind. He's rather going to argue that, I'll use a word that I haven't used before for the first time, that this is a speculative sentence. And we'll have to figure out what speculation is. But the speculative sentence is, faith and pure insight are one. That is, they are two halves of an integral freedom that do not add up. And that last phrase is not from Hegel, but from Walter Benjamin. Two halves of it. But he's talking there about high art and the art of the culture industry, but Benjamin wrote speculative sentences. Two halves of an integral, they mutually depend on one another, but their very construction is a construction in mutual repudiation of one another, so that they belong together, but we experience in them a fundamental direction. And in the direction from one another, we, of course, are direct, split off, alienated from ourselves. So having no content of its own, pure insight is a drive to intellection and rationality, a metaphysical desire for universality, and as such, it challenges every content to meet its standard of rationality, namely some notion of something like self-evidence or certainty. And in paragraph 541, Hegel argues that pure insight gives itself its content, as I've been suggesting. Now he says it concretely, through its skeptical procedures, which is to say, by the critique of religion. Faith is here cited as a consistent realm of error. The masses are naive and credulous before the priesthood. They suffer from the despotism of the church, etc. Because faith itself is skeptical, that is, because faith, part of the problem at the moment of the Enlightenment is that, and this, by the way, is the whole history of religion according to Weber. Faith always wants to argue with reason. Big mistake. Because once it argues with reason, it throws itself into doubt. That is, it takes on the standpoint of the enemy and therefore can't hold itself in place, so that while enlightenment disavows its own identity with the faith it castigates, it thereby preserves that content, but now as something unabsorbable. That is, it won't allow it to have any conceivable meaning. In her analysis leading on to the French Revolution, Home presents this thought as arguing that there is a constitutive melancholia afflicting insight. And its melancholia is what condemns it to its own violence. That is, the violence and this is again just the movement of dialectic, by its negative attack on faith, it ends up excoriating itself as an impossible emptiness, and therefore the violence it perpetrates on faith, saying it's all empty and worthless, is matched only by, Home's word is, insight, manic jubilation. That is, there's something hysterical about Enlightenment rationality. There's something about a incessant pleasure in the cruelty of its practice, a certain constitutive living off of the power of its violence, right? And it does not see that very manic pleasure in destruction is simply its inability to acknowledge that other as its own. Right? Well, let me think about this in another way and see puzzle books. Everything at this point in its sense is going to depend on broken relationships in which the thought of absolute dependence, of one's dependence on the other, this is going to be true epistemically as well as morally and politically. Every thought of dependence is met with violent denial. That is one of the things that we find most intolerable, most unacceptable, is that we are absolutely dependent on one another. And therefore, the only thing we can do in order to escape this sense of dependence is to destroy the very other we are dependent on. Let me put that argument another way. Paragraph 549. Hegel says, whomsoever I trust, his certainty of himself is for me the certainty of myself. I recognize in him my own being for self, know that he acknowledges it, and that it is for him purpose and essence. Trust, however, is faith. Trust, however, is faith. Because the consciousness of the believer is directly related to the object and is thus also intuitively aware that it is one with it and in it. I want to think about faith and pure insight for a moment as what I want to call fundamental or constitutive anthropological moods. Faith, I'm going to suggest, is the mood of trust, and insight is the mood of suspicion, doubt. Why? And what's the dialectic between them? Faith is here presented as being in possession of an unconditional ground for trust. That's one way of expressing what faith means. And by the way, I think that's what Barth, right? I think that's his idea of our relationship to God. I mean, this is just late modern Protestant theology. Your relationship to God is your absolute dependence on the other. That's just what Barth's theology is, I think. So, faith is this belief in being in possession of this ground. So, in a certain blinded way, the notion of faith is a transcription of the attitude of trust in the other. Mutual trust is an image or form of mutual recognition. Faith, that's what Hegel's arguing here. Faith thus expresses an absolute trust in the other, which is a recognition of my absolute dependence on the other, which, if deserved, if appropriate, gives me back my being for self, my independent self. So what faith is a rationalized and ruined version of trust. That is, faith is trust in the world after trust in the world has disappeared. Right? Faith is always all faith is a disbelief in the existence of God, right? And that's just obvious. Right? You can only have faith because there is no God and He does not exist. Otherwise, faith would be unnecessary. So the experience of faith is the experience of the loss of the possibility of trust in the world. Someday, I've been invited to give a paper at the English Institute next year at Princeton on bad faith. That is the thought of all faith is rotten and bad. And I just couldn't resist that possibility of trying to argue that. But I think it's true. I think it is. Okay. Faith, thus, is... So, faith is what happens to trust when it is torn from the world of intersubjective relations and forced into the recesses of subjectivity. Faith is the desperate attempt to acknowledge dependency when the conditions of acknowledgement have been eviscerated. As I've already suggested, both faith and enlightenment, faith and pure insight, are nothing but the self-thinking itself. Their dialectic occurs because, again, there's a mutual repudiation of one another. So the question now is, why does faith has ruined trust, and that's my thesis, it's a ruined form of recognition, end up as nothing but an empty self-relation? And the answer is, as blind, as absolute, it has no relationship to its object. That is, faith is the impossible yearning for the object in the absence of the object. Okay? So the only thing that binds me to the objective world is the self-confidence that I've got it. So there's an ambivalence. This is what, by the way, the whole chapter turns, or this section of it, turns on an ambivalence. Hegel keeps saying that these are the same. Well, why? Well, when insight says to faith, look, you think you believe in God, it's just merely subjective. Faith says, that's what I keep telling you. Right? I keep telling you I'm in immediate possession of the absolute. Right? So the two positions can't separate themselves out. They both think that subjectivity and the absolute are one, but in these utterly differentiated modes. Pure insight now, so I want to think about faith as an exemplar of what I'm calling this anthropological mood of trust. Pure insight is a permanent critique, is grounded in a mood of suspicion. And you will see when we get to the French Revolution, Hegel's going to argue that the epistemology of the terror is suspicion. Are you really one of us? How do I know that you're really a revolutionary? Prove it. Since the proof cannot be had, the guillotine, right? And just going to work just like that, over and over. Okay, so there's this mood of suspicion. Now, this is an anthropological mood, I'm arguing, because it is a general orientation that allows more specific philosophical positions to emerge. It sees in trust, and this is the point I wanted to get to, only the threat of self-loss. That is, in the experience of absolute dependence, I don't get myself, I lose myself. And therefore, so the mood of suspicion is a defense mechanism against the possibility of collapse into the other. The mood is one of never seeing myself in the other, seeing myself always as possessing a perfect independence from the other. Right? Suspicion is the demand for absolute independence, which is unsatisfiable, and which is why it ends up as a kind of manic skepticism. You have to keep doing it over and over and over again, because nothing is going to convince you you are really independent if, and it can drive you nuts when you're teaching undergraduates, because you say, oh, well, look, at least let's accept, the law of non-contradiction. And some undergraduate will say, oh, yeah, but that's a power over me. No, I'm going to rebel against that, and you realize that anything that has a claim to independence or objectivity then looks like a power over you, is coercion, is a denial of you. That's what suspicion is. And it is irreducible, I'm arguing. Irreducible. As a mood. I'm using the Heideggerian, obviously I'm trying to use a kind of Heideggerian kind of notion of mood here. Now, if put this way, then the relationship of trust to suspicion you can now think of as one version, or as the mood that gets worked out and fails in the master-slave dialectic. Right? In the actual dialectic of independence and dependence, the one thing that never happens, that looks impossible, is trust. The master enters into the battle for pure recognition in order to demonstrate independence from nature. He does not need to trust it or others, because eventually he makes himself transcendently independent of nature. And we know what the master does not see is that he is absolutely dependent on the slave twice over. The slave knows that he is dependent on the master, but that fact is intolerable to him. And he seeks to transform himself through transforming nature in order to make himself independent. Remember, Stoicism, skepticism, all those moods of self-consciousness are right, illusory forms of independence. For both master and slave, dependency is seen as negative, something to be overcome. Faith and pure insight cannot provide convincing accounts for the preference of one of them over the other, because in both cases they have deprived the self of all transcendence, all actual dependency, and hence they both end up as a kind of self-certainty. Where do I want to go? Faith, of course, finds the arguments that, because of criticisms that pure insight makes, beside the point. And you might say they're beside the point because I almost want to be Wittgensteinian here. The thought of faith is something that is such a deep-seated and constitutive orientation toward the world as a whole cannot be a matter of delusion. That it may be wrong in how it thinks about itself, right? But it must have something right if it has the capacity to provide for significant, reproducible social relations. Right? The notion of religion, as I've said in Hegel, is the notion of cult, always. And therefore always the notion of religious practice. It's now that this religious practice is being forced to have a reflective understanding of itself as grounded in faith. And therefore, the reflective self-understanding of its practice, right, is undermining of itself and the practice. Nonetheless, in paragraphs 552 through roughly 558, Hegel tries to show that at each point the Enlightenment critique misfires. So it misfires because, as I've already said, faith wants to say, yeah, subjectivity and absolute are one. When Enlightenment says, well, what's this stuff about relying on Scripture? Enlightenment forgets its own mediations. When Enlightenment says those things in the church, they're just bits of wood, Enlightenment is coerced into a reductive materials. Right? So each time it tries to show the emptiness of religion, it ends up emptying itself out, of making itself worldless. Okay. When religion sanctifies its form of religiosity, pure insight comes up with its own form of religion, namely deism. The idea of the clockmaker God. And it's introduced in paragraph 560. When we think of deism, we should not be thinking merely of the argument from design, but rather, Hegel argues, as a far more generous way of seeing how the universe fits together as a whole. Namely, it is a picture of the world, a picture of the universe, in which each thing is both for itself, just this thing, and purposeful for the other. That is, each thing is both an in itself and a for another. Everything in the universe for deism is useful, purposeful. And of course, Hegel's arguing that is the source, the ultimate, the real source of utilitarianism. Not the nasty version of it that comes from thinking about capital, but thinking about an idea of everything as metaphysically purposeful. So this idea is that comes from a very modern way of thinking about the world, namely the world as made. We may say that the difference between Enlightenment religion and traditional religion, in traditional religion the world is created. Ons creatum. In Enlightenment religion, it's made, the way, indeed, a clock is made. So, it is made as an artifact. So everything fits together in terms of having a purpose or use. And Hegel then, I think, provides actually a very compelling account of this, let's call it utilitarian metaphysics. But he says that this utilitarian metaphysics and the materialism that it goes along with both share fundamentally in a representational theory of knowledge which ends up as itself subject to skeptical doubt. But he equally suggests that there's a way around this. Why not, he asks, and this is how he understands what happened, why not apply the theory of utility to beliefs as well as actions? Kind of anticipation of pragmatism, right? That is, we will hold just those beliefs that work and work well, blah, blah, blah. Right? So this would allow for a theory of knowledge and action that is immanent and self-correcting. In short, utilitarianism does not need deism. Well, on the way to this argument, in paragraph, so I've kind of leapt from deism to utility. And in the middle, toward the end of section A, is paragraph 573. And this paragraph 573, forms the needful background for understanding what Hegel is going to think about utility. So after he has done his dialectical work, Hegel says that for faith, the absolute is unknown and unknowable, and then goes on to say that the difference between faith and enlightenment is that enlightenment is satisfied and faith is unsatisfied enlightenment. It's a yearning for the absolute. And he carries on. However, we shall see whether enlightenment can remain satisfied. That yearning of the troubled spirit, which mourns over the loss of its spiritual world, lurks in the background. Enlightenment itself bears within it this blemish of unsatisfied yearning. As pure object in its empty absolute being, as action and movement in its going beyond its individual self to an empty and unfulfilled beyond, and as an object with a content in the lack of selfhood in the thing that is useful. Enlightenment will rid itself of this blemish. A closer examination of the positive result, which is in truth, will show that in the result the blemish is in principle already removed. What Hegel is arguing here is that the emptiness of faith entails the emptiness of enlightenment. That enlightenment in emptying out faith empties out itself. Hence, everything that follows, and that's why this paragraph is so important, and these claims about mourning and yearning for what? For the lost object. Everything from here on in is going to be about the lost object. And it's almost impossible when we read this not to think of the lost object in purely psychoanalytic terms. That is, this is about the originary constitutive loss of the object. That object that we never had, right? And that we yearn for, that would make everything all right. So let's say that, I can see the puzzled looks. Remember that all along, the great temptation is realism. That is, the great temptation is to want some fact of the matter, some object out there to make my life true. Never going to happen. But to say realism is false, I'm saying, is equally now to say that in some constitutive sense, right, we are constituted by an absence of the object, an originary loss that we have to acknowledge. That is, whatever it is we might have wanted by believing that there was an object that could ground us in our relationship to the world, that original hope that's been there from sense certainty on, right? What does it mean to say that desire is defeated? Well, along the way here, we've been saying, it means everything is internal to self-consciousness. Isn't that Jim Dandy? I mean, there's been... what I mean is, we've bought this kind of idealist line as if it's cost-free. As if everything we wanted by having the real object, we could get by going idealist, by thinking that everything is internal to the object, as if no loss was involved in that fact. Right? As if, which is sometimes how I feel about what Wittgenstein does. I sometimes think he thinks we just get it all back. Right? And the suggestion that Hegel is making here is that there is this constitutive loss. There is this melancholia driving us over this lost object that we want to make good in our freedom. So we have, as it were, two impossible absolutes crunching against one another here. Our notion that we are subjects, which means free and self-determining, all the notions of subjectivity that go along with the notion of faith and pure insight on the one hand, and on the other hand, right, our sense that there is an object out there which, if we could be in possession of it, would ground us in our relationship to the world. But it's not as if we are easily going to get it all back. And right now, this is the moment. The moment here is a moment in which this problem of dependence has taken the form in which we do not, in that are requiring the moment of subjectivity, subjectivity is in these moods, in the Enlightenment, which means from the moment of Descartes to, for Hegel, the moment of German Romanticism. These moods is a continual experience because of this belief in self-grounding. Right? That's the illusory belief. We can purely ground ourselves. Right? And in that mood of the attempt at self-grounding, there is a melancholic desire for the lost object. That it's the experience of loss that's driving these ever increasingly, ever hyperbolic, ever pumped up desires to be purely self-grounding. So every time we fail to ground ourselves, we push the world further away. So what I'm saying is here, the Enlightenment has a disavowed grief for the lost object. And it's the disavowal of the grief that is ultimately going to run through and be the cause of the revolution. So one of the things that I'm going to try to be arguing over the next 4 or 5 weeks, how many weeks we have left, is that this is a book which I said to you when we were reading Antigone about figuring out how to mourn. And if it's figuring out how to mourn, that is, how to lose the object in an appropriate way, which is to how to lose realism in an appropriate way, right? That's the claim, then if we're not yet mourning, then we're in melancholic despair, right? We are, and therefore, in each active, triumphal attempt to ground ourselves, we are simply disavowing the grief that's driving the project. How? All that Hamlet's about. How am I reading Hamlet? It's another course. No. Hamlet is the and by the way, Hamlet never gets there, right? Hamlet is cannot get over the loss of.
I'm king of infinite space where not that I have bad dreams.
So, with this, then, so utility ends up as a vandalism which appropriates, manipulates, and consumes the last shred of objectivity, including the intersubjective world. And it reduces the intersubjective world to a collective survival mechanism regulated by a pleasure principle committed to a notion of reciprocal serviceability. Now we know how this argument's going to go. That is, we know a bit about the arguments concerning utilitarianism. Utility, and I'll just say a few words about utilitarianism and then we'll have a break, because Hegel brings us to absolute freedom by thinking about utilitarianism. And the move is actually very, very simple. Indeed, it's very content. Utility, he begins by suggesting, cannot be a mere way of understanding the world, but must become a principle, an ideal. All things are to be judged according to their utility. And that raises all the standard problems of utilitarian moral theory, namely, how do we compare and contrast different desires? Which ones ought we to act on? Do we judge our desires by their qualitative character or by sheer quantity? What is the greatest happiness for the greatest number? We can go on, but we need not go on and on, because the question, Hegel says, is, wait a minute, who's doing this judging? Who is doing the utilitarian reflective act? What kind of self is it that could attempt to become a utilitarian calculator? Well, a necessary condition for the possibility of being a utilitarian calculator is that the self must be detached from its given natural ends, and it must be free to order them in a particular way. So utility presupposes freedom, and it presupposes not just any old freedom, but free self-determination. Utility is a version of free self-determination. So the groundlessness of the nihilistic despair of Ramu's nephew becomes now as freedom of choice. We are now beginning to talk about the self as shorn of all determinacy. So we're now beginning to talk about, let's call it, sublime freedom. Freedom that always determines and is never determined. Natural desires and inclinations drop away as constitutive of who we are. So, if there's to be a system of goodness, it is going to be a system that is dependent for its satisfaction on our willing it. So, willing is the right or the correct kind of work of self-determination. And not just any old willing, my willing must be compatible with all others similarly willing. Hence, social order is both an experience of what I will and what we will. A fusing, an ideal fusing of the personal and impersonal standpoints. What we get now is a joining of individual and collective self-grounding. And what we get through self. Will. Okay, let's stop there for a moment. Have a little break. I probably said too much already anyway. See if we can actually say something about the French Revolution. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
We were wondering about moods, anthropological moods, and in relation to what you're saying at the end of this first half about our problem being mourning, what do you think, and this about grief as a problem associated with modernity, and therefore as symptomatic of a certain rupture with whatever came before.
Absolutely.
And so how is it that we can understand insight and faith are symptoms of this disavowal of grief? We understand those anthropological moods if by that you mean something that's just the human being as a creature has moments of suspicion in an historical sense. If it's an historical problem that we're trying to, or an ethical problem that we're trying to unpack. Why move to anthropology if it's an era that we're trying to?
Right. What we are certainly looking at an era. And the era is the disavowal of grief. But the disavowal of grief, I'm arguing, is an actualization of an underlying mood of suspicion. So suspicion, I'm claiming, is the underlying mood, and I'm saying that suspicion comes about at any moment, right? I mean, so the argument is something like, I'm buying the argument that trust is a necessary condition for our experience of the world. And I'm assuming that if trust is that idea of always already being dependent on the world, then what endangers trust, that is, whenever we discover, as we always do, this is the argument, that our trust is not fully rational. Right? That's the problem. That everything we trust will let us down. We all know that. Right? But once you know that, then you have suspicion. Right? So suspicion and trust, I'm thinking, are underlying structures of permanent possibilities of our relationship to the fact of dependence. I'm not claiming that they are particularly modern. Rather, I'm arguing that what modernity does is, because of the discovery of subjectivity, right, it has to rethink that notion of dependence. Right? And now we're going to get the disavowal of grief, because we're going to have the lost object. So you can think about it as loss of the authority of nature, or you can think of it as the death of God. Which is why Christianity is always melancholy. The founding fact of Christianity is God is dead. That's how it starts. Right there on the cross. We can point to him. That's a dead God. Right? And that reverberates in its ambiguity throughout the whole, we'll come to this, throughout the whole history of Christianity, of how seriously that loss is a loss, right? And that it becomes, hyperventilated at the very beginnings of modernity. Holbein's Dead Christ in the Tomb, or the Eisenham altarpiece. Eisenham altarpiece. That's a dead God. That's a really dead God, right? He's green, grim. So is that help?
It does.
Okay. The suggestion, I don't have an account of this. The suggestion certainly of Christeva's Black Sun is that pre-modern forms of life, pre-modern religions, were simply that they were simply adept at structuring loss. That that's what their power was. It just so happens that they did so on the basis of groundless beliefs, but nonetheless, they had an apparatus that allowed them to deal with objection and loss. And we don't have that. And Hegel is, the phenomenology is going to be that, try to be that object, that practice. Okay. So we have moved from the empty thinking of the self in pure insight and faith to what it would be via utility, to what it would be via the notion of absolute freedom. Modernity, which is coming to self-consciousness about itself here, is just the giving up on grounding oneself in any given. That the idea of free self-determination entails, as modern writer after modern writer says, some kind of impossible bootstrapping operation, some trick of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, some impossible gesture like that. And in this case, it occurs by the way in which my will and the general will get connected. So the argument here is that I am free and self-determining, when I will in accordance with the general will. In this setting, what we have then is an attempt at a socialization of the self through a form of willing, and that this socialization occurs if it's the case that my free self-determination is equal to what would be willed by any self who was considering what it would be to be free and self-determined. That is, in thinking that what makes the general will possible for Rousseau, his way of thinking about it, is that I should think of what I consider as a maximal act of free self-determination. That is, what laws I would be willing to obey if I were just anyone, right? And if each individual thinks in those terms, then what we end up thinking, if we're lucky, is what the general will would will. So put the question another way, what can I will that is free? And Rousseau suggests that we have to think of what would be good for me in a way that is equally good for everyone. Hegel puts it this way. The general will, he says, comes into existence in such a way that each individual consciousness raises itself out of its allotted sphere, no longer finds its essence and its work in this particular sphere, but grasps itself as the notion of the will, grasps all spheres as the essence of this will, and therefore can only realize itself in a work which is the work of the whole. So before I go on, what's all this stuff about spheres? Spheres are the practices of a community. Spheres are historically sedimented ways of going on. They are what our family practices are, what our economic practices are, etc., etc. And now we're saying, look, that historical, evolutionary, slow development of these spheres, that doesn't match the demand for free self-determination. So now I have to take each and every bit of our social practices and put it in relationship to the principle of free self-determination. And in putting it in relationship to the principle of free self-determination, I have to count as naught the fact that this is the way we've always done things around here. I have to count it as naught that this is a perfectly utilitarianly serviceable way of going on. I have to count it naught that this is practical in use. All of this is just a bit of nature. That's just all nature. The opposite of freedom. So we have to root out all those givens of community, all the givens of history, all those congealed and sedimented practices, everything we might think of as tradition. Therefore, we have to root and branch. Hegel's go on to say all the various ways that people collect themselves into social groups, into classes and the like. So he continues. He says, therefore, the general will can only realize itself in a work which is a work of the whole. In this absolute freedom, therefore, all social groups or classes which are the spiritual spheres into which the whole is articulated are abolished. So what gets abolished is Sittlichkeit, ethical life. It has to be abolished. And it has to be abolished because they're not grounded in free, self-determining activity. The individual consciousness, Hegel says, that belonged to any such sphere and willed and fulfilled itself in it, has put aside its limitation. Its purpose is the general purpose, its language, universal law, its work, universal work. It's all paragraph 584. Hegel thinks, and there's a whole subtopic here that's very nicely, by the way, handled in Stern on Hegel's relationship to Rousseau and the French Revolution. And I just want to say here, pages 158 to 161 in Stern. But it's important that here we note that Hegel is not leveling the same criticisms of Rousseau that he does level against him in his later writings. On the contrary, at least here, the argument seems to be that Hegel's interest here is not showing, as it were, that Rousseau is false. His interest here is in showing how Rousseau's doctrine actually does generate or ground or lead to the French Revolution. So the standard arguments against Rousseau certainly are here not the ones that are going to be at stake. Well, what is important at this juncture is that Hegel thinks that Rousseau's notion of the general will is the means by which utility is turned from a mere desideratum into a concrete actuality. The general will cannot be a mere criterion of legitimacy, which is all that Rousseau intends it to be, right? Rousseau, I should say, was very skeptical about the notion of will. I mean, the odd thing about the notion of general will is it's not a will, right? And he makes a big deal out of that. But Hegel is saying, no, the French Revolution inherited Rousseau, and inherited Rousseau in such a way as to say that it has to be more than a principle. It has to be a real will. So the general will has to be the real harmony, the actual harmony of the general and the particular. And it's therefore, and this is, I take it, the point, it's therefore the attempt to make actual the harmony between universal and particular, which was only an illusory harmony in the Greek world. So the French Revolution is trying to do that, what appeared as that beautiful, illusory together of universality, particularly in the Greeks. The French Revolution is, in a certain sense, an attempt to make that actual. This willing, Hegel argues, when put into practice, is the French Revolution, and hence the truth of enlightenment is the general will, and the truth of the general will is the French Revolution, and the French Revolution necessarily, for Hegel, ends in the terror. So Hegel does want to argue that the terror is not an accidental or contingent feature of the French Revolution. He thinks it's intrinsic to the very idea of the French Revolution, and he does think that the French Revolution is a certain performative realization of the underlying principle of modernity as subjectivity, that is, as free self-determination. The crux of those arguments concerning the turning of the French Revolution into the terror happen in paragraphs 589 and 590. So I first want to how do I want to handle this? I'll just look at a few moments of both of those paragraphs, and then I'll elaborate. So the top of paragraph 589, Hegel says, just as the individual self-consciousness does not find itself in this universal work of absolute freedom qua existent substance, so little does it find itself in the deeds proper and in individual actions of the will of this freedom. So the first problem is, can I, if we put the revolution into practice, can I recognize myself in the product of this attempt to reconstruct society as a whole from the ground up? And Hegel says that this notion of freedom is impossible because it has cut itself off from all possibility of content. That is exactly what would be the content of this free self-determination. How would we determine what is the content? Well, the only conceivable way of doing this is to at least say something like that everyone must will the universal will. That is, the least we can expect is an absolute conformity of all with the will of all. But that's not a content. That's still a form. And therefore, the end of the paragraph, Hegel says, universal freedom, therefore, can produce neither a positive work nor a deed. There is left only negative action. It is merely the fury of destruction. So think about what I said about Enlightenment and skepticism, about Enlightenment trying to make the object world match its inner sense of validity. Well, now I'm saying that the practical version of that is just the French Revolution, which can only say, well, whatever it is, that's not universal freedom, that's not free self-determination, etc., etc. It can only be this fury of destruction. Paragraph 590. But the supreme reality, and the reality which stands in the greatest antithesis to universal freedom, or rather the sole object that will still exist for that freedom, is the freedom and individuality of actual self-consciousness itself. Okay, right? So, let's skip it. No economy, no families, no social relations, okay, all that goes. But surely the one thing that can be in accord with the principle of freedom is freedom. That is, free people determining themselves as free, right? So the idea here is, well, at least we can will the idea of all of us as ourselves actually free and self-determining in a universalistic mode. For that universality, which does not let itself advance to the reality of an organic articulation, and whose aim is to maintain itself in an unbroken continuity, at the same time creates a distinction within itself because it is a movement or consciousness in general. So, it doesn't allow itself to be a work or world, but it still has a practice. And moreover, by virtue of its own abstraction, it divides itself into extremes equally abstract, into simple, inflexible, cold universality, and into discrete, absolute, hard rigidity and self-willed atomism of actual self-consciousness. That is, the one thing it can hold on to is abstract universality, the principle that this notion of universality that's true of each and every particular is the universality we want. And then if you're going to use that as your criterion, then you have to reduce the individual to their absolute singularity. That is, deprive them of all natural characteristics or qualities or personality, so they become atoms. Now that it has completed the destruction of the actual organization of the world, and exists now just for itself, this is its sole object. An object that no longer has any content, possession, existence, or outer extension. But this is merely this knowledge of itself as absolute, pure, and free individual self. All that remains of the object by which it can be laid hold of is solely its abstract existence as such. So in order to think serious universality, we have to think serious abstract singularity. That's what universality demands. The relation then of these two, since each exists invisibly and absolutely for itself, and thus cannot dispose of a middle term which would link them together. Obviously that's the clue of what we're going to need, some way of linking them together, is one of wholly unmediated pure negation. A negation, moreover, of the individual as a being existing in the universal. The sole work and deed of universal freedom is therefore death. A death to which has no inner significance or filling, for what is negated is the empty point. Notice what is negated here. Not any rich, complicated human being. What is negated is the empty point of the absolutely free self. It is thus the coldest and meanest of all deaths, with no more significance than cutting off a head of cabbage or swallowing a mouthful of water. Think of I've already suggested, and now I'm going to try to follow this argument of Rebecca Come's. I've already suggested that there is at work here a melancholia. That is a failure of an acknowledgement of loss. Right? So I'm saying the attempt at self-grounding, I mean, just think of it easily. The attempt at absolute self-grounding is the same as the denial, right, that there's anything out there. Right? That there's anything that you could have lost. Right? So the notion of absolute freedom as terra is a kind of infinite melancholia of a self that knows no other, that is in fact a denial of otherness. Its essence is to recognize no obstacle, no mediating agency, no local nuance or detour that might delay or dilute the passage, and that's what we're trying to get to, the passage from individuality to universality. The question is, right, Hegel says, right, that the problem here is there's no mediations between the individual and the universal. So that somehow the goal of the French Revolution is to unite the individual and the universal immediately. And it has to do that, right, by getting rid of anything that would stand in the way of that immediate connection. So what it wants is a movement that is a movement from the universal to the individual, and from the individual to the universal back again, without any friction, without any resistance. That I should be absolutely identical with the principle of revolutionary freedom. I should be, I mean, this should just strike us as what's true of every revolution we've known about over the last, well, since the French Revolution. So the idea here is that the individual should fuse themselves with the universal immediately, totally, and without residue. The link between the two sides is abstract individualism. That is, between the right of each against all, and the right of all, the universal, against each. So that's the two principles that have to get contradictorily locked together. The right of each against all, that's my free self-determination, and the right of all against each, that's the absolute claim of universality. Now, what all of this does is it shows, or what it's set out against, and I want to continue the argument where Hegel started, it entails the loss of the binding power of religion. Religion is about connectedness. Religion is about the social bond. That's all religion is about. Religion is simply the enactment of the social bond as social bond. So the critique of religion, and I want to be clear, what happens is, and I've said this before, and I want to say it again because it's conflated. We have to distinguish between the critique of a transcendent God, which is a pretty silly idea, with the critique of religion, right? And the idea is that the critique of religion, and by the way, Marx made this mistake, because he modeled the critique of ideology on the critique of religion, and you can think of ideology as simply a version of the conditions of sociality, right? So that, it's not an accident that Marxism ended up in some of the extremes it did. So, what the revolution sets out against is the bonds of sociality, and therefore it splinters the community into an aggregate of simply volitional atoms, and it therefore loses any notion of the political. The French Revolution is the political act that forecloses the possibility of politics. Another way of stating this would be to say, so we can think now of Polynices, the problem of burying Polynices, as the prototype of the disowned other. the outside that is on the inside, that structure is set up through a repression or denial that will allow no otherness. That's what I meant when I said that suspicion is the epistemology of the French Revolution. Can't find the passage here. I'll find it in a minute. So the reduction of the individual to anonymous oneness is already the reduction of the individual to an object on the assembly line. And it is therefore a submission to a new idea of sociality as pure rationality. So Hegel's target in discussing the guillotine, what I underlined when I said, what's killed? Not a full person, but an abstract self. So Hegel's target is the paradox of a murder that strips away not only the life, but the antecedent subjectivity of the victim. That is the principle of the guillotine. The guillotine's essential action is to render itself essentially redundant or inessential, because all it does is provide practical confirmation of the object's essential non-existence. To put it another way, it strips even death itself of its singularity and intensity. So the claim that these are abstractions that are killed means there is here a death of death. No object to mourn. So we're in the territory here of what Adorno will call the philosopheme of pure identity. That is, death in its most unsublimated, insignificant uniformity. Modern death. Now, it matters to all of this, therefore, that for Hegel's argument, that terror is therefore essential to the revolution. It belongs to its internal logic of unfolding as how do we want to put it? What's at stake here is the problem of sovereignty of the nation. Right? So the argument is as structurally complete. Why structurally complete? As purely self-determining. How can you be a self-determining collective subject unless you're one? So you have to be structurally complete. So as structurally complete, the nation must eliminate what falls outside it as something whose excessiveness is simply a contradiction. This is why the founding of revolutionary democracy is always a purge. Always a getting rid of anyone who does match that. requiring terror. Is not just the result of a philosophical abstraction. It is itself a form of abstraction in practice. That's why it's so terrifying. Terror is what abstraction looks like when it walks the earth. A leaping, to use Rousseau's phrase, from all to all. And that can end only in a repetitive production of nothing. Only product, Hegel says, is death. All of this, let's be clear, is what Hegel means by the word the negative. So all of this is what we've been thinking about all along. But now it is coming out, and this is the moment of the negative in its pure form. This is why this is in a way the heart of the book. That this is the emergence of the principle of the negative, which Hegel says is the self, right? The self is the power of negation, is the same as death, right? All of these now are becoming actual in this moment. So what we have here, however, is nothing but negativity, which is to say nothing but unworked death. And that raises the question, which I've been trying to suggest for the last hour or so, namely, what would a worked death look like? If the problem here is that what we've got is nothing but unworked death, just death as mechanism, then the flip side would be, what does worked death look like? What would mourning look like? What would the acknowledgement of loss look like? Which is the question, what would finitude look like? What would finitude, not as privation, but as constitutive, look like? Right? All of these I take to be the same question. Okay, I need to stop. But what I want to at least end with, and I'll start here next time, is we should not see this moment of negativity as a leading out from what we have been following all along. After all, have we yet seen in this book a happy death? Have we ever seen someone actually buried successfully? And someone walk away from it? Al-Naisi doesn't get buried, needless to say, but that was equally the problem in that feudal section, right? There could be no, the negativity and the death haunt us not because anyone's failing to acknowledge their existence, it's that we don't know what acknowledging that yet means. And if we don't know what acknowledging that means, that is absolute loss, then we don't know what finitude means. And we don't know what finitude means, then we don't know what freedom means, we don't know what subjectivity means. All of these things are getting jammed together at this moment as homing in on this problem of free self-determination, because free self-determination bears that notion of the negative, necessarily. Yeah, for next time, certainly start reading Kant, Morality, Well, we'll certainly get well into that next time. Maybe even further.